Hello and welcome, everybody. Lots of faces. Turn your cameras on. It's always nice to see people and see your faces, even though, this is gonna be a really interesting conversation. Oh, it's so good to see you all. For those of you joining for the first time, we'd love to know where you're dialing in from. So use the chat. Tell us where you're dialing in from. Introduce yourself and your company if you'd like. And we're going to get started really quickly. Okay. And for those of you joining us for the first time, ConveneVR is a venture firm on a mission to reshape the NASDAQ by supporting and investing in tomorrow's most powerful companies today. I am Divya Kakad, partner at ConveneVR, and very excited to be hosting today's conversation with Martina and Leslie. I'm going to introduce you both in just a second. If I can, my windows, every time I move things around, I can't see you, and that's not fun. So hold on for 1 second. Okay, Martina, welcome. Martina Welkhoff is the founding partner at Goldenrod Ventures and the WXR Fund, early stage venture funds investing in women-led emerging tech companies. Prior to launching her first fund, she ran an accelerator and has been a serial entrepreneur who founded her first company, Zealyst Bank, in 2010. Leslie Feinzaig, of course, is an operator turned founder turned VC. In the last 5 years, she turned a 25% Facebook group that many of you are aware of, Female Founders Alliance, into what is today a 50,000 strong community for women-founded startups and aligned investors, and raised a venture capital fund to invest in and with the best of them. She's the founder and managing director of ConveneVR, an early stage venture capital fund too. And as you registered for today's forum, many of you submitted questions to be asked, and that's what we use to inform this discussion. So for the first 30 minutes or so, I'm going to use those questions and have this discussion between Martina and Leslie. And then I'd love to get some questions live from this group in the chat. So if you can just put your questions in the chat, I'll try and weave it in into the conversation and try and make this as interactive as possible. Sounds good? Great. Jenna, do you want to spotlight the speakers? Thank you. Great. Well, let's get started. Okay. Hi, Leslie. Hi, Martina.
Hi there. Thank you for having me today.
Of course. It's also nice because we're all in Seattle and it's a beautiful day out today.
It is. Yes.
We're just talking about long summer days. Okay, so to get today's conversation started, I'd love to hear from you guys on, what does it mean from an investor's point of view? What does it mean to be an AI startup? What do investors really care about? Leslie.
Yeah, so I guess I could start by saying that, most startups that are being born today are going to be AI native startups. So it's almost like saying today every company is a tech company. In the future, every company will be an AI company. And that just means that there's lots of different ways that your startup could be leveraging AI to make your operations better, to kind of save costs in some places, to make your work faster. So in that sense, all of you today can make your startups AI native startups by leveraging AI tools that make your work a lot better. That is different from saying a startup that either is building its own AI, right? So it's building its large language model, or is building an application with proprietary data or proprietary tagging and teaching of the data, or that is kind of leveraging existing AI tools to deliver a better service to customers. So I would say that those are the kind of 3 different ways that you can think about what is an AI startup. One is just AI native, like I'm using it for my operations. Another is, we're building our own AI. And the third is we're leveraging existing AI tools and kind of repackaging them for a specific use case. Martina, how would you kind of shape particularly the latter two, which is where the kind of crux of the investment is happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think one useful framework I've used to think about this is sort of the first degree and second degree effects. And if you're, like you said, if you're building something proprietary that's to your product that is, enabling a new sort of interaction, or is based on, it could still be leveraging larger, LLMs that are open APIs, and it doesn't necessarily have to be as if it's built solely in-house, but there's some sort of proprietary IP that is distinguishing it from third-party tools that are available. But like you said, more broadly, I think every startup really needs to be thinking about integrating AI into their workflow and what that looks like from a product roadmap standpoint, operationally. And I wouldn't classify those startups per se as AI startups. I think, and I know we're going to get into kind of the nitty gritty of marketing here, or messaging around this, but I do think for any business really out there, not even just tech startups, thinking about how these tools can impact your bottom line and what that looks like from a day-to-day standpoint is a really important thing to be educating yourself on, and also be able to speak to if you are talking to investors, because it's quickly becoming table stakes.
That's really helpful. You talked about messaging. How should companies be talking about their use of AI in their pitches in a way that's believable and authentic, right? Because I think every founder we meet now, like you said, Leslie, is, every startup is using AI in some form. But how would you talk about what would you advise the founders should be doing to differentiate their messaging based on in their pitches?
You want to take a stab, Martina?
Sure. So I think some of the advice that applies universally here applies, in that I think startups should always lead with the problem they're solving and why they need to exist. And then AI, can be part of that solution and description, but I wouldn't necessarily lead with, we are an AI startup, before you've gotten to what is the problem you're solving and the value you're creating. And I think I just saw a headline last week in Crunchbase that is something like, this generative AI startup doesn't want to be called a generative AI startup. And it was a little tongue in cheek, kind of talking about this place we're in the hype cycle. But I think the crux there is that, and I feel this way about any sort of hype cycle. It's like, if you're leading with the hype, to some extent that's discrediting out of the gate. So, lead with why your company and product needs to exist. And then if AI is a key piece of solving that problem, great, and lay that out. But I wouldn't sort of start with, we are an AI startup. I know some startups have it in the name and stuff, and that's fine. But I think from a storytelling perspective, always staying true to problem first is a more effective way of pitching.
I could not agree more. And I feel like I'm going to borrow that phrasing that, if you're leading with a hype word, then that, causes more questions than it does. I know it feels like it might feel like you have to have a story, and you have to sort of, and particularly because the fundraising market in general is really brutal right now. And it feels like the only part of the market that is not having a brutal time fundraising is the AI market. And so I understand that there's an incentive to try to, pitch yourself in that box in order to have some relief from the really brutal fundraising cycle that we're in. But it just can really, really backfire in a very spectacular way. I would say, to Martina's point, every company needs to be solving a problem, and that's what we're investing in. How you're solving it is the second question. The first question is what is the value prop that you're trying to achieve, and for whom? And I would also say thinking back to the idea, like, are you a startup that is using AI to sort of improve your operations internally, right? Like more like an AI native type of thing, like sort of the same way that you would use cloud storage instead of, hard drive. Like AI is a tool for your operation to be better, then I think that maybe is not a central part of the story. That's just sort of you're operationally effective. If AI, it truly is a more central part of the story in the sense that you are using language model or LLMs to serve a particular problem in a particular customer, or like I said, like building your own whatever proprietary data set or like specific way of training, or like additional training on top of open data or open source or open AI, then I would say, like, here's the thing. There are bigger questions today. So I would say three things. One is, if you're truly like a core AI company, then I expect to see an AI expert on the team. Not just a software engineer, but like a true, data scientist or somebody who has been building an AI for a really long time. I would expect them to kind of be in the first meeting probably, or just be like a very kind of prominent part of your story. The second thing is like, if you are an AI, like a core AI company that was born 2 months ago, and had never been working in AI before, then like that brings up real questions around, you know what I mean? Like generally, and we invited Martina to this forum because Martina's been investing in AI companies for many years, as have we. And I think that like the key is like building on AI, including on like ChatGPT, like this is stuff that people have been doing for years. And so, if a company is pitching like, well, we just started working on this, never worked on this before, that's sort of a little bit less believable than maybe you've been doing research on it, or maybe you're partnering with someone who has been doing research on it. That's a little bit more believable. Like those are the two things that I would say is like, what is the trajectory of this team working in core AI? And second is like, do they have like the right founding team and the right like capacity for fundraising? And then the third thing that I would say is, I think that there's an incredible opportunity to use, to like leverage some of the existing AI tools in order to deliver better value to your customers. And that's somewhere in between being an AI startup and being kind of just using them for your own internal tools. And I think in that is, so like, give an example. So like, you are I don't know, I'm going to pick like Zendesk. You're a customer service company, like customer service, software as a service company, and you've been building on that forever. And all of a sudden with generative AI, you can make that experience for your customers like way, 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 way better. So that is, I think, something that like can create a ton of value and is a more open like founder set than a core AI company. Like a lot more people can believably do something like that. But then the question for me becomes, I hope that what I'm saying is clear, right? But like the question for me becomes, this is like the question that every founder hates. But okay, well, why won't Google do it? Why won't OpenAI do it? Like if it truly is something that is so easily doable with AI, then how do we know that that is not one of the extensions that some of these bigger companies are going to go after? And honestly, that's like a really, really, really hard question right now, because unlike when that question gets asked about like true massive incumbents, these are companies that are really well known, that have operated for a really long time, and you kind of understand what their like business processes and priorities and future are. Like you kind of know what their investment areas are. But when it comes to AI, like the biggest players are startups themselves. And so it's like really hard to predict where they're going and where they're not going. And I think, there's nothing you can really do about that. Like you just have to kind of be aware and know that like that is going to come up for some investors. Like, okay, well, is that where the bigger AI, better funded AI companies are going? Or is that something that you can like create any kind of moat or protection around. And the truth is that you kind of don't know. And it's sort of a known risk that is going to attract some investors, and it's going to put off some investors. And so that's like an extremely long way of saying it really depends.
I just want to piggyback on that. I think the one thing that is helpful to think about there, and when you're just kind of looking at the defensibility question more broadly, is I've been talking to a lot of founders about sort of the vertically specific applications. And if you have expertise in a data set and customer relationships, and just the more sort of vertically specific your solution is, the more protected you are in a lot of different capacities. And so that tends to be in this market that we're currently in, that tends to be a little bit more straightforward story to tell there. So I think that's one way. I guess the equation roughly is the more generalized you are, the more danger there is for kind of competitive headwinds, or not even just competitive, but to just be swallowed entirely in this environment, versus if you have that degree of specificity, and not just from a product standpoint, but kind of from a commercial perspective as well. That's a nice way of answering that question, which I think is so important in this market. And I saw just in the chat pop up just a question about whether we're talking about other things outside of generative AI, which generative AI is obviously the hot topic of the moment, and we naturally gravitated there. But I have invested in computer vision and machine learning and personalization applications. So we can certainly talk more broadly than that. But we just sort of dove right into the generative AI side of things, given this moment that we're in.
Yeah, and I think when I talk about AI, I talk about AI generally, not just generative AI. I think like the hype cycle is around generative, but the opportunity is far broader than that. And by the way, that's a great point, Martina. Like the more specificity you have, and like the other thing that we didn't talk about when we answered the first question is your point about like a commercial moat, right? Like which it's so funny because like when you're in the middle of a hype cycle, like it's like the fundamentals of business building are even more important than when you're not in a hype cycle. And so that like customer problem, that value proposition, that like sector expertise and relationships that you have, and like the ability to go to market. Like it's funny, I hear a lot of investors when we talk about AI say that what they look for the most is an unfair advantage in go to market. I'm like, well, that has nothing to do with AI. Like that is like just like a business thing, right? Like that's just like a benefit all across. But it just goes to show how competitive the market is and how hypey it is, that like what investors are looking for. And I honestly like care less about the fact that this is what investors are looking for, but more about like what that tells you about your likelihood of success is the ability to like sell something to someone sustainably and for the long run, basically, right? Like that, and that entire statement doesn't include any technological advantage at all.
I love that. I think it's really important to just keep that in mind, right? Ultimately, your business needs to be sound. Lead with your problem. You need to have customers. There has to be clear evidence of demand, whether or not you are using AI. And if you can use it, and if it is native or whether it's you're leveraging it, it doesn't matter. Like the story still needs to be about the problem and how you're solving it. Okay, we talked about hype. And we know this is not the first hype cycle we have recently gone through. So if you want to, I'd love to hear how you separate signal from the noise, and if you can share some anecdotes of sort of writing out. And Martina, feel free to lead this one if you would like. If you can share some anecdotes from writing the Web3 cycle, what would you say about the AI hype cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. This is not our first rodeo here. And I even think back to when I started my first company, it was in the era of big data, and everything was big data startup at that point. And there's always sort of the flavor of the month. And I do think that the moment we're in is more than just sort of, I don't want to be too flippant about it. There's obviously a lot of exciting and substantive opportunity here. But there are, real pitfalls to be aware of. And I'll actually, so a big part of my investment practice over the last few years has been what we now, or what some people now call the metaverse. We didn't start out calling it that, and it's kind of falling out of favor again. But last year, or 2021, everything was, all metaverse all the time. And just a quick anecdote there, I was talking to a startup that was a metaverse 4X. I won't say exactly what they're building, but that was sort of on their title slide, was metaverse for this particular community. And they sort of went through the pitch and got to the end, and I said, well, what does that mean? You never really told me what does a metaverse for this group of people mean? And they said, well, it's a metaverse, and they didn't really have, and I was asking them to describe in plain language and really break down for me, what is this experience? What is the product? What is the value? Kind of getting back to those fundamental questions. And they either didn't have the answers or couldn't get past the old mental block. I don't want to, I think I understand in pitches, it can be a stressful moment, but it was just so illuminating to me of how dangerous it can be to get into that hype and lose sight of what fundamentally are you building, and how can you describe it in a way. I actually do this when I do my own decks. My initial challenge to myself when I'm outlining the narrative is to use 0 buzzwords, because I think if you can describe something in plain language and tell your story in a way that someone outside of our tech bubbles could understand and relate to, then that's a very strong foundation for the narrative you ultimately want to build and go pitch. And so I think try not to start with the hype, try not to start with the buzz, really go back to that, why do we need to exist, and describe that in language that would make sense to, a wide group of people. And then you can go back in, obviously AI is not a bad word, or these other, hype cycles that we've been in. It's not that you can never use those words, but I don't think that they should be sort of, again, what you lead with or at the core, because especially when you get to some of those harder questions and try to get to the substance underneath. And that's what really matters at the end of the day. And if you don't have good answers there, and you haven't been thoughtful about what exists beneath the veneer, that's going to comes through pretty quickly. And I think right now, those questions will come even sooner, that we're all on the investing side, we're conditioned to see through the hype and to see we're poking holes right out of the gate. And so it's pretty rare that an investor will be distracted by the use of those phrases.
And this is a horrible thing to say, but I think that last piece that you said, the more experienced the investor, the less likely they're going to be distracted by these. So like you are going to get sort of newer investors, unsophisticated, or kind of folks that just have money to deploy somehow, right? Like that are being less thoughtful about how they deploy it. And that can be very big names just as well as, so there is some, money just needing to go somewhere, and nobody's going to get fired if the money goes to like a credible founder with like a buzzword on the title. So that does happen, but it's more the exception than the rule. And I think particularly with the audience that we are talking to today, it is highly unlikely that it's ever going to happen to you. That's just realistic, right? Like you have to fight a little bit harder for those dollars. And so I guess like when it comes to hype cycles, Martina made a point about this earlier, that like when the sort of the conversation becomes about the hype thing versus about the value that it creates for customers, that's when like the bubble really kind of grows out of control. And I think that like metaverse / VR have both gone through that. I think like, Web3, like the entire conversation about Web3 was rarely about what value it was creating for whom. It was about all of the things that it could do, rather than like who needs it. If you think back to like ICOs, right? Like initial coin offerings are like all the rage for a while. Like it's really unclear who they were creating value for, other than people that needed money. like people that were like trying to get money and like by sort of selling something. So the more that and even like all the way back to like the late 90s, early 2000s, right, when like it was like really unclear what the web was capable of. And so that's where you kind of really run into trouble in a hype wave. And I think what's hopefully different about this wave, at least on the investment side, it feels like the potential for this technology, even though we don't know how it's going to change and how much it can do, it is understood. It is like generally understood that this is like a really, really, really big shift. And I think that was not necessarily the case, right? Like with like blockchain, for example. I don't know that people like a regular everyday sort of pre-seed investor would have necessarily known what blockchain really was and how it changed things. And I think that's different today. I think it's like a little bit more intuitive that, okay, machines are going to be able to do a lot of things that like humans currently do in these different types of ways. And we don't know how much, but we know that that's sort of where the thing is. I think that that's really, really different, which makes it like, yes, there's a hype cycle, but there's also like really substantive opportunity, really substantive understood opportunity underneath it. I think that makes a little bit different than like past hype cycles where it truly was just like the tech itself was like very kind of murky what value it was creating and like for whom. And so that makes me really kind of hopeful that that there's going to be more substance to come out of this one. And then the second thing is, I think that the other thing that makes this hype cycle a little bit different than past ones is the fact that the rest of the market is stalled. And I think in some ways it's provided this like release valve a little bit for the ecosystem to kind of be able to invest in something without quote unquote getting fired by their LPs or by their like boss or whatever, right? Like, so I think that makes it a little bit different when you think about like the job of a professional investor, like a professional VC, takes money from limited partners and invests it in startups. And then, we build firms where people report to like the managing director, and those are the people that are out looking for startups. And when you have a market that is stalled, it's like harder to figure out what to put your money into that's not going to piss off in the short term whoever you're reporting to, whether that be your managing director or whether that be the limited partner that put money in the fund. And so I think like this hype cycle has created a little bit of air cover for more active investing, when like there's a lot more fear and uncertainty about basically anything else out there, because the VC market is correcting and is kind of not entirely done correcting. And so that like I think is a little bit different than before. And I think for founders, it can be really tricky because you have a feeling that this is the only place where you're going to get any traction in your fundraising, but it's a little bit of a red herring. Like it's not actually like a true, it's not actually a true statement that like by adding the hot words into your deck and figuring out how to tell a story around them, you're going to have an easier time fundraising, because that's rarely actually happening out there.
This actually is a great segue into my next question, which was about the market. Are you feeling like round speeds are the same when it comes to AI startups, or not so much? Doesn't make a difference? I mean, you talked a little bit about this already, but what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the headlines can be a little bit misleading here because we see the huge mega rounds close for AI companies, 100+ million right out of the gate. That's happened a couple of times this year. And those are the ones that get a lot of attention. And funding overall, if you look at the category, is higher than market. But when you break that down, those are a lot of mega rounds, and those are a lot of companies that are already quite well established. So from an early stage perspective, and I think especially when it comes to underrepresented founders, that can really have that, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance there that can actually add to stress in some ways, because then it feels like, oh, well, everybody's getting funded but me. And I think on the ground, that's not the case. I've seen a couple in this quarter, I've seen a couple of really, legitimate AI startups with traction still have a very slow process. I think they'll be able to raise money, but it's not like they're just picking cash off trees by any means. It's still a difficult market even for those companies. So I don't think that the perception that it's just easy if you're positioned correctly is necessarily true. As Leslie said, it does happen. There are those stories out there, and there are those companies out there that close huge rounds in a matter of days, but it's pretty rare. And I think the media does a disservice in the way that's depicted, and that's not the experience for the vast majority of startups and the vast majority of entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be kind to media because they also have very little to report on otherwise. It's like
It's good news.
yeah, exactly. It's like I mean, that's a whole other, we should do a forum on that. But yeah, I completely agree. I think I have said before, I feel like I learned this lesson once a quarter, that fundraising is a tale of two cities. It was a tale of two cities at the top of the market. It is a tale of two cities at the bottom of the market. Fundraising is a tale of two cities. If you are of a certain type and really well connected, it is going to be much easier for you to fundraise. If you fall outside of that, it is going to be much harder for you to fundraise. And I think if you think about that as like a sort of range from the best connected, best sort of in the click, to the sort of nobody knows me and I completely don't fit the type. I think the difference is where that barrier sort of has shifted. So I would say that at the top of the market in 2021, the side of the faster rounds was substantially bigger than it is now. So I think it's fewer people that are achieving those, much, much fewer people that are achieving those super fast, maybe not super fast, but fast and very large funding rounds. I think nearly everyone else is having a far harder time than they would have a year and a half or 2 years ago, a far harder time. That includes companies that are AI native, that includes companies that have been building in AI for years. It includes companies that have amazing revenue traction. Nearly across the board, every round is slower. It takes a lot more to get people over the hump. Valuations are lower, round sizes are smaller. All of those things, at least I'm still seeing, are super, super slow. And it's funny because these days, even founders that I look at them and I'm like, they should have no problem raising this round, are a 2-month fundraising process, or a 3-month or longer fundraising process. So I think the market continues to be super slow, and cognitive dissonance is the name of the game. It's absolutely huge. I call it gaslighting. I think, you're all being gaslit. And I think that you should not be totally in your head about your fundraising, not going as fast as it appears that other people's are on Twitter. So that's just never true. Yeah. And we can talk about what to do instead, right? We've said before, to begin with, you should not be starting a company for the sake of raising capital. You should be raising capital for the sake of growing your company. It's sort of and I realize that it's a lot harder to do today. But it is going to make for far stronger companies on the other side of the struggle.
This actually is a question that was sent earlier in the, through one of the one of the attendees. Do you think in today's day and age we can still get by without using AI? What if you are solving your problem perfectly fine and not using AI, but are you expected to now start leveraging it? And I think sort of piggybacking on something that you said earlier, if you are using AI within your model, how important is it to have that proprietary IP or data that only you have access to? These are two separate questions, but I want to put them in there. Who wants to go?
I can take a stab. I think kind of back to the earlier point we were discussing, I do think it's important for every company to be thinking about how they can leverage AI, not necessarily integrate it into core product, because that's not going to make sense for every company. And you don't want to force that just because it's popular at the moment. But I think procedurally, and I think this is even true of brick and mortar businesses at this point, honestly, that there are tools so readily available, ChatGPT being the most obvious one, but there's many others that can expedite workflows, that can, there's all sorts of ways they can be applied depending on your specific business. And that piece, I think everyone needs to be thinking about regardless of what they're doing. Core product, it is completely dependent, and it is not going to be something that every business needs to integrate, right now necessarily. I will say though, it's interesting. I have found myself in pitch meetings asking about, my mind as an investor often goes to, oh, well, they could, integrate AI personalization here, or they could, once they have enough data. And so I do think there's kind of a longer term time horizon where maybe it's not, especially if you're a pre-seed company, maybe it's not what you're building today. But if you'll be accumulating a lot of data, if you have some sort of interesting angle you could work in the long term that could incorporate AI into your vision, I think it's worth discussing that. And again, it's not what you lead with necessarily, but thinking through that and knowing that that's often where investors' minds are going is useful, just for showing that you're kind of making, you're up to date and you're thinking about how you can ultimately continue to level up your product and your competitive advantage. But I just worry when people are forcing it in a way that doesn't A, feel authentic, it doesn't, but B, doesn't necessarily offer real value. To Leslie's point about sort of Web3, I never want to see cool tech being applied for cool tech's sake. There needs to be a real reason and real value at the end of the day. And I think that's the filter I think about is, is this kind of being wedged in here because it seems like the thing to do to fit into this popular narrative, or is it because there's ultimately, a value delta that it's creating that is very clear from a commercial perspective?
Such a good answer. Such a good answer. I used to work in games, like in gaming, and there was this one, I won't name and shame, but there was this one kind of had this one very senior person that one of my game teams reported to, and they would like obsessively, as you do in games, obsessively play every competitive game in our category. And anytime that the sort of bigger competitor, King or whatever, would like launch a specific feature set, he would come to us and be like, well, what are we doing about this? And like, why aren't we launching this? And then we'd have to like go back and sort of figure out how the heck to fit the new feature into our carefully thought out and tested roadmap. And so it literally just like, it felt like every Monday or like whatever day it was that other company was like their ship date, like that day would come around and like we would be turning left again. Like, okay, so now we're like zigging on the other way. And that is not a way to build. I mean, that specific game got shut down before it even launched. And like, that's just not a way that you build a business. And I think that applies to what you are building as well. The true answer, like the original question that Divya asked, is like, do you need to is this something that you have to talk about? Or can you raise money for a company that is not at all AI? I think that the answer, I mean, I can answer it two ways. One is absolutely, you can raise capital for a company that is not an AI company at all. I think you should intelligently be thinking about how different AI tools can make your work better, but you can absolutely sort of back to basics, simple business, go to market, advantages, and like launch a company that is not an AI company in this market. And there are investors who are going to actually really get excited about that. Flip side is there's also investors out there that will invest in cool tech for the sake of cool tech. Like there's all kinds of, it's just, they're not in this room. Right. Like we are kind of sort of commercially minded investors. And so like, that's not who is talking to you right now, but they exist. Having said that, that type of company is more likely to look like a deep tech company than it is to look like a short-term commercially viable company. And so it's a different set of investors that are going to be really excited about that. The second way that I would answer this is depends. Because I also think that like, depending on what you're building, if AI is like an obvious, like an obvious part of the solution, then I would expect you to be talking about it. You know what I mean? Like if it's something to do with communications or like anything that like can improve over time with machine learning, like, and you are not thinking about it, then I'm going to assume that there are competitors out there that are and are going to do a better job than you. So it kind of does depend on what is the business that you are building. And that is probably more accurate. Now, like if you happen to be building a business where like, yeah, like, what you really need here is just a go-to-market advantage and pretty simple tech, then, no, you don't need to talk about AI, but in other cases, yes, you should. And all of this, like, it literally comes back to like the first thing that we said at the top of the hour, which is what problem are you solving for whom, what is your solution, and how is it defensible? Like fundamentals.
Can you dive into the second part as well, which is how important is it to have that proprietary IP? So say you are actually using, AI. I know that we've met companies, and that's kind of the question that we kind of double on, right? Why is this proprietary? What is the data that you're using? Can you talk a little bit about why that's important and why founders should be able to sort of defend or think about that piece when they are presenting a truly AI native business?
I can start this one and then hand it over to you, Martina. I mean, defensibility is a word for every startup. This is not just for AI, right? So like, the fact is that at any given point, if you have a truly good idea, I guarantee that there's 100 other companies working on it. You know what I mean? Like, there are no original ideas, I don't believe, like, at least not in things that are commercially sort of ready. I think that they're very original ideas on the edges of like scientific discovery, for example, or like engineering discovery. But things that you can build with tech today, most of those ideas exist. There are other people working on them. And so the real question is, can you execute well enough and fast enough? And whatever you are building, can you defend it long enough to build a big business around it? And so that's the question of defensibility. And like, it literally applies to every startup across the board. And what I am looking for is like, I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be the same factor of defensibility for every company, right? Like it's not necessarily going to be IP for every single company, but it has to be something, and it has to be special and specific to the thing that you are building. So it might be, in a kind of vertical specific company, it might be that you have like a huge network in that particular space. Or you're doing an enterprise SaaS company, it might be that you are a go-to-market expert in enterprise SaaS and like have done it for 3 other companies before. So that there has to be something around like, what do I believe gives them enough air cover to like build substantively and win in what I assume is going to be a very competitive space.
Yeah, and I think with the sort of broader AI category, IP becomes imperative because of how rapidly things are moving, and in many cases, in certain cases, I guess, tools being commoditized. And so it's hard to speak in entirely general terms, but I think for most use cases, having defensible IP, having something that is giving you both the product edge, and ideally I love to see both. In a perfect world, you'd have both a product edge and a commercial edge of some sort. And as Leslie said, it's going to be different in each case, and the types of leverage you have will be different. But I think in a space that is moving as quickly as AI is, it's difficult to defend without IP that is unique and proprietary to your business.
And the IP, I mean, at least when I look at it, like the IP might be the model itself, or it might be in lots of cases the data. Like you have access to data that nobody else has. That has been something that, at least for us, we have favored over time, like not just proprietary data sets, but unique data sets, and also like sensitive data sets, right? Like LLMs tend to be trained on publicly available data. Well, what do you do to build businesses when the data is like highly private and sensitive and not public? So like that, there's IP beyond kind of the technical side of the IP. It can also be the data itself.
Okay, looking into some questions that came in from the chat. Here's one from Jonathan. AI startups often requires a lot of computing power. How would you present a business model that depends on cloud pricing of GPUs? I don't know, who wants to take this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the capital intensive nature of certain, and particularly if you're building, an LLM or something where it depends on the size of the data set, obviously, but when you get to a certain point, those costs become significant. And I think it's a rare case where, I mean, on the one hand, you have OpenAI and the Microsoft investment where that strategic relationship is basically all, credits. Like that's the bulk of where that investment has gone. And so I think even for smaller startups, building strategic relationships where maybe it's not an investment, it could be, but it could also be, a partnership or a deal where you're getting some sort of cost break or special pricing right out of the gate can be helpful. And it's helpful just to demonstrate you have those relationships and you're thinking that way. So I think that's one way to just kind of bolster your credibility in that story. And also this is another place, I think about it almost like hardware investing to some extent, where depending on the size of the fund and the capital deployment structure, highly capital intensive models aren't going to make sense for smaller funds in particular. So thinking about that in your fundraising strategy as well, is if you have a capital intensive model, that changes the profile of the funds that you should be talking to. Obviously, it changes the goal for the funding threshold you want to hit as well. But from a manager standpoint, I manage smaller funds, so capital intensive models tend not to work well for us because those rounds get so big that our allocation is, the allocation that we can afford from our fund isn't big enough to make the economics make sense. So that's something to think about when you're just sitting down and building your pipeline and thinking about that strategy, is that will preclude certain funds, and that will change the way you position in your strategy overall.
I think those are two great points. That I would add a third, which is being thoughtful about like the top line of the P&L, right? Because I think for all startups that are leveraging either computing power or what is currently like free AI, I assume that there's going to be a cost to that down the line. And I think it becomes really important, more important than ever, for the company to prove that there is an end customer that has a willingness to pay, that can absorb a margin hit down the line. And so I think that like that's another part of the story that I would tell, is like, okay, well, what are you selling to whom and how much are they willing to pay, and can you prove that? Because I do think that like things that in the early days of a startup, even if a startup that is not necessarily that capital intensive to begin with, I do think that like there's going to be margin creep from things that you're using for free in the very early days that are going to tie you in, and the costs are going to explode. And you kind of don't know, because like you know, cloud credits, like you can get a bunch of like thousands of dollars of cloud credits in the early days of your company, and then you kind of know how to model the cost of them later down the line. I think when it comes to plugging into GPT-3, GPT-4, whatever model that you're going to plug into, I believe that one day there's going to be a cost associated with that, and I don't know how much it's going to be. But I do know that like that's not going to be free forever. And so, or I would be shocked if that is free for everyone forever, because OpenAI is no longer a nonprofit. And so yeah, just like, you know, back to business fundamentals, like what are you selling to whom? How much are they willing to pay?
Thank you. There's another question here. When talking to some customers about our AI virtual advisor, I have often encountered mistrust and fear of AI. Their fear seems to stem from the accuracy of results and potentially losing users if the AI starts hallucinating. How would you suggest I address these concerns?
I missed the beginning of the question. Is it from an investor standpoint or a customer standpoint that they're asking how to address the fear?
I believe it is.
Hey, so I'm on the call. It was from a customer standpoint. Thank you for taking the question.
Yeah, I think, and this is obviously a very common topic in the generative AI space, a really interesting one too. It's one I've spent a lot of time because it's just sort of fun to go down this rabbit hole. But I think something that can be very helpful, and this is true of customers or investors, but particularly customers, to establish right out of the gate are the particular guardrails you have on the system. And especially if it's a sensitive context, I've noticed that there's sort of a spectrum of consequence with these different interactions. And let's say you're in a medical system or a medical context, for example, that's much higher consequence than if you're in, you know, just sort of a generic chatbot, you know, in a context where the consequence doesn't matter so much if it isn't quite nailing the response. So making sure that your guardrails are context dependent and you really understand the consequences of going outside of that and what those thresholds look like, and then making that as tangible as possible for customers, like really walking them through how you're enforcing those guardrails and how you've tested them, because that's the other big thing. I don't know if any of you heard the story of the chatbot, I think it was the American Association of Eating Disorders released, and it ended up giving people dieting advice, and like really, it was really, really bad, like the opposite of what they wanted to happen. And it was because they hadn't adequately tested it. They had sort of just tested it in this very narrow and specific way that, of course, once it's out in the wild, it starts to behave differently. And so providing as much transparency and information around the testing process and how those guardrails are applied, I think can really help to reassure. And then the other piece of that being, you know, what are your customer service and response mechanisms should something go awry? So, you know, proving that you have the ability to respond and react quickly if anything were to happen.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I mean, I think like that is one reason why AI will not be adopted as fast as the hype cycle says it is, because there is like real business consequences to deploying it too quickly. And I tend to think that's a healthy thing. Like, I think that's actually good that that customers have a healthy degree of concern about what it's going to do to their communications if they just kind of deploy this thing. So I don't have a better answer than Martina. I would say that it's more of a roadmap question than it is a sales question. Like I think that you need to be able to ensure that you have like guardrails in place, and that you know like what your kind of accuracy and sensitivity rate and the AI's response. And those are not things that happen quickly.
Yeah. I think there's an interesting nuance to the trade-offs with guardrails too, because back to the chatbot that was giving dieting advice, the reason it happened was actually they had very strong guardrails in place, but that meant that the conversation stayed in a very narrow place. The chatbot couldn't really go off in many directions. So they ultimately loosened those to make it dynamic, but in the loosening, they also, gave it this freedom to go in directions
Too
they
much
didn't.
freedom.
And so I think that's, really walking a customer through what are your priorities here? Is your priority to have the most dynamic range? Is your priority to have the highest degree of safety? And understanding the trade-offs in those decisions. Or maybe this isn't for a customer conversation, but internally really understanding those levers and being able to explain that to a customer, I think is an important piece of it.
Great question. And it's like a real-time problem for so many companies right now.
And it's just so fascinating because I think it's the really humbling aspect of all of this too, because even the people building the technology don't understand why it behaves in certain ways. And that's when it gets into some fun sci-fi territory. I think it's really
fun is not what I call it, but we
I
can
just think
also
it's
watch a Disney movie afterwards.
Sci-fi for sure. I love that. Okay, we are almost on time here. At time here. Jonathan has a follow-up question from before. Oh, sorry, there's one more.
But actually, the new question, I think, would be more interesting. The follow-up is not as good as what I just thought of.
Go for it. Do you want to ask it?
Thank you. Yeah, sure. So my question is regarding evidence-based generative models, which are reliant upon a set of data, and they simply build a response based on the search terms that match the data set that they are using. So the question is how, and the real question behind it is, how honest should the model be in that, how honest should the software be when it provides an answer saying, this is the answer that I'm giving you. If you care to explore how I got to this answer, here are the links, etc. So that we can, from the one hand, give our customer as much control or a feeling of control over what sort of responses they're receiving. And on the other hand, allow for imitation or any sort of copying or showing how simple essentially the model can be sometimes. So yeah, that's the question. Thank you.
And, Martina's going to have a better answer than me because she's more technical, but I would say, like, for the sake of humanity, I would wish for complete honesty. But I also recognize that, like, part of what makes these solutions interesting for customers is the simplicity of the output, right? Like, and not having to sort of have like a super complex response page. But I don't have an answer. I think it's like highly dependent on who are you serving and like what's their tolerance for complexity. Martina, do you have a?
Yeah, there's two themes that come to mind immediately with this question that I think are interesting to explore and probably they are bigger conversations in themselves. But one is bias, and we've seen a lot of discussion around this, that depending on the data set you're using, and certainly depending on the original information sources you're pulling from individually, you're going to have some degree of bias just by virtue of having a contained system. And so I think understanding and to some extent illuminating where that bias might be coming from by tracing back to the original data set is helpful. In most cases, we don't get that, so we have to sort of extrapolate what might be informing those responses. But I think this broader question of ethics around bias and some of the assumptions, there's the popular assumption that AI is sort of this magical bias-free mechanism, when that's of course not the case at all. So I think that's one piece of the question. And then the second piece is around IP and attribution. And especially if you're getting into anything where you're essentially repurposing original IP, whether that's images or text or, when then you're sort of resurfacing something that is seemingly original, but essentially just derivative of that original IP. I think that's another place where we collectively are going to have to come up with a better system. And I know Adobe's working on this and others to find systems to make that both more transparent, but also and actually attaching that to economic value and making sure that original creators are getting compensated for the way that their work is being repurposed. So those are just the two threads my mind immediately went down, and it's contextual, I guess, depending on the use case and the specific data that you're using on how transparent that could be. But I think this is where actually some Web3 technologies could be really interesting for tracking and being able to ultimately, share that information in a way that makes sense for the end user. So there's so much more. That's a really interesting question, and I think an entirely separate webinar because there's so much there.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I know that Divya is about to wrap us up, and I, you know, there's a lot to talk about. There's like also a lot to absorb. Like there's so much information out there. I would say if you're a founder and you join today and you're just trying to get your startup off the ground, like focus on the fundamentals, I think is the most important part of the entire story, right? Like focus on the fundamentals of your business, because that is what, and like if AI is a part of that, then explore that and communicate that in a really authentic way. And that is what gets you through to wherever your next milestones are going to be. But like playing into the hype cycle itself, you know, is kind of at your own peril.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Martina. Thank you everybody for joining us. This was a wonderful discussion. The recording will be available and we will send it out in a follow-up email. And hopefully all of you receive our newsletter. So stay tuned for upcoming programming. We'll try and, incorporate talks like this because we know our community, asks for topics that people have most questions about. So we welcome that. And just quick announcement, we will be opening our apps for Catalyst next month. So if you are subscribed to our newsletter, make sure you look out for that. But otherwise, thank you for joining us. And thanks, Leslie and Martina, once again.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.